So we had also gone through a long and difficult time in our marriage, and we were really very ripe and harvestable people, but we were so limited in our understanding. We didn't know the first thing about Christianity. Some months before this occasion in which Dick came, I had gone to Las Vegas to work with one of the groups that I was working with at the time. At that time I had a show group, but I was also developing a rock and roll group called the Righteous Brothers. And while I was there in Las Vegas, I went through an experience. My wife and I had been separated for a few months, and I went through an experience that began, for me, marked the beginning of my spiritual trek towards Christ. What had happened was that I had, in the heartbreak of separation and all the pain and agony that goes with that, I had been seeking God in my own way. Now, it's difficult when the only people you know are musicians and druggies and alcoholics and bartenders and waitresses. And I mean, that's the only people I could have dialogue. That's who I was getting my marriage counseling from. You can imagine how good it was. And I was having dialogue with them about religion. And they were saying, oh, yeah, I'm into religion. And we talked about all kinds of diverse religions. One guy recommended that the best thing I could do is when I got off work, and by the way, I worked a late night shift, and that was a kind of a prestigious thing to do in Las Vegas. The later you worked, the more important your musical group was, because that kept people up. And I would get off at 4 in the morning, and I began driving out into the desert and watching the sun come up, because someone told me that was a good way to groove on a religious experience. And so I had done that a couple times, sat out there and watched the sun come up. And nothing happened, nothing special anyway. But this one day, I was driving out there in the morning, and as I was driving, I began reflecting on where things were in my life. Everything was a mess. My relationship with my wife was not good, and my kids, and everything was a mess, My career was zooming. I was doing well in that area, but I was an unhappy guy. And I was driving along, and I began weeping. Now, I had learned one thing in my 28 years as on the earth, and that was that a man ain't supposed to cry. You know that one? And so I'm driving along, and I begin weeping, and I'm embarrassed. I was not only embarrassed, I was humiliated. And I thought, oh no, this is weird. This is really weird. And I was crying more and more, and I began sobbing. And finally I had to pull over to the side of the road, get out of the car. I walked around for a while, cussing and kicking the cactus and trying to get a hold of myself. And I think it grows more dramatic with the telling, but at one point, you weren't there, were you? At one point, I stopped and I looked up at the heavens, and for the first time in my life, I saw the stars and constellations as something emanating from someone. And I remember standing there, I was sort of awestruck, and I said, oh God, if you're there, help me. And I wept for a couple moments, and then all of a sudden this deep shame came over me. I thought, oh no, now you've really done it. Now you're talking to the dark. You've gone over the edge. Well, the only thing left is I'll go commit myself into the hospital. But then I remembered that part about my mother and the underwear, and so I thought, well, I better go by the hotel and change before I go to the hospital. You know that part? From that high, I've been learning that one. And so I went on. I went by the hotel, and when I walked in the hotel, besides that, I had some drugs that I thought I'd better put away in case I was in that hospital very long. And so I went by the hotel, and when I walked in the hotel lobby, the night clerk yelled at me and said, hey, John, there's a message here from your wife. And I said, from my wife? It can't be from my wife. I mean, my wife wouldn't even talk to me anymore. I mean, it can't be from my wife. And he said, yeah. I said, call this number. So I went over to the lobby phone, and I dialed it, and sure enough, my wife answered the phone. I said, well, what do you want? And she said, well, I've been thinking it over. And she says, I've decided to give it one more try. Come and get me. And when she said that, it was like a blow to my chest. I fell back against the wall, and I thought, wow, I'm in touch with the supernatural. Because I realized suddenly that that there was a connection between that, oh God, if you're there, help me, and my wife responding. And I said, when did you do this? When did you decide this? She said, about a half an hour ago. And I thought, I got her, And so I said, well, I'll be right there. Now, I was in Las Vegas, and we lived down by Newport Beach, Fountain Valley, actually, in those days. And I got in a car, and I drove there in 3.5 hours. Now, for those of you that are not from Southern California, you don't know how hard that is to do. But I drove fast. Anyway, I remember I got in the car, and I'm driving along, and I'm excited, and I said my second prayer. My first prayer was, oh, God, help me. And now I said, atta baby God, And
I love Jesus. I love the stuff he did. I love the multiplying of the food and the healing of the sick and giving sight to the blind, spitting in people's eyes. I mean, I love that stuff,
The first time he went to church, Wimber says he expected miracles.
Nobody did it.
After just 3 Sundays, he was frustrated.
So I went up to this guy, and I pulled on his sleeve, and he had something on his chest with his name on it, so I figured he must know something. I said, when do they do it? And he said, do what? I said, the stuff. He said, what stuff? I said, the stuff in the Bible. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, multiply the fishes and the loaves and feed the hungry and all that stuff. When did they do that? He said, oh, we don't do that. We believe in it. We pray about it, but we don't do it. And I was terribly disappointed. I said, wait a minute. You don't understand. I gave up drugs for this. I gave up my career for this. You mean I don't get to do it? When I worked for the devil, I got to do the devil stuff. If I'm working for Jesus, I want to do what Jesus did. I want to go as far as the Bible goes. I remember at one point in our church, there was an incredible outpouring of the Spirit, and people were knocked all over the place, and they shook, and it looked like somebody threw a bomb in the middle of the room, frankly. I went home frightened. I was up all night saying, oh, God, what's happened here? What have I done? How did this happen? I'd never seen anything like that or even heard of it. The next Sunday I came back to church, and there were a group of people, and they were waiting out in front. They were incensed. I could see how angry they were, God bless them. And they said, just how far is this going to go? And I remember I had my Bible in my hand, and I said, it'll go no further than this book. And they took comfort from that. I thought, haven't they read this book?
"19 months later, we came back. It was just John and me, the team. John, me, James was 6, and Marcus was 6 months. He'd been born in Anaheim. And we came back, and we had an omnicord, which we used as our main means of worshipping.
Does anyone know what an omnicord is?
Look
it up on Google.
It's a relic.
It's like an electric auto harp.
That's what it was, yeah. And it just says D, and you put D in it, and then you do the... And I just followed the chords in the book. And I mean, it was ludicrous. It was ludicrous how much the Lord turned up whenever we plugged it in.
So you basically chopped everything in, kind of cut ties with the Anglicans, went under Wimber, came back here, eventually with his blessing. Did you have a plan B? Did you ever think, what if this doesn't work?
No, we didn't.
Like, what will we do?
We'd done a church. Wimber said, produce a church planting plan. He was a fantastic planner. He was utterly pragmatic. I need a plan. I need a 5-year plan. What are you proposing to do? So John, of course, who was hugely systematic and thorough, he put together a remarkable paper. I think it was about 70 pages long of what he thought God was saying, why, blah, 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 blah. And then I added in the appendix, which was the 33 occasions on which we felt God had spoken to us. And we presented it to Wimber.
Amazing.
And he said, I'll go with this. But he said, the plan, John, is fabulous. You've done it beautifully. But he said, the thing that really, really hits us is the 33 instances. And he said, we have never had as much guidance for anything we've done than God has given to you. So we were blessed, beyond blessed.
That's wonderful.
It was wonderful. There was no alternative.
Did you ever have to look back at that to remind yourself that this was the Lord?
I think once we were off, we were off.
You were off, amazing.
And Wimber said he was very generous to us. He gave us our airfares and he gave us enough money for a month. That was it. And he said, and if it's the Lord, the rest will come.
Wow.
Which again is pretty scary. So
Wow.
First months were very
Amazing.
scary.
On the 1st of September, we started church, 4 of us. Rupert did the worship, Katie prayed, I preached a sermon on church should be fun, and Ginny sobbed the entire time. And the next day we went into church shrinkage as the 2 children went back to London. About 6 weeks later, we had our first house group. People who were going to King Alfred's University in Winchester, who had met our 2 children at Soul Survivor. My mum and dad are planting a vineyard in Winchester, and they made contact, and we started our first house group with students, mainly, and it just somehow grew. I think we got 2 house groups by Christmas, which wasn't bad going, and then we had a third by Easter in 1995, and we started then to have once a month gathering in the evening, and I think we got about 25 people by that stage. We'd always wanted to have the presence of God as something, because having the people without God wasn't worth doing. But if you had God in the church, you were bound to gather people. So I think whatever we were doing, and you would have fun doing this, it didn't have to be sort of serious or religious, but it had to be God-focused. Then we went to once a fortnight in the evening, and I think after that, I seem to remember after about a year, we were probably going weekly in the mornings. We started in a pub somewhere up the top of the hill in Winchester, I can't remember where now, and we then moved into the community centre by Sainsbury's, and we met there.